Good afternoon. Thank you for, I'm Paola Zirilli, a scientific coordinator of the XPRESS project. EU Commission funded the XPRESS project, facilitating green public procurement. Thank you, Pedro Salomé, researcher from the International Iberian Nanotechnology Center. Thank you for participating to our stakeholder cafe and for presenting during it and supporting us during the entire project. So I just had a few questions to ask you in connection to the XPRESS project. So can you give me some example of development of green technologies in renewable energy sources and services, like any experience that you recently had?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the opportunity. As a research and technology organization, we are committed to supporting SMEs and the society in general in the transition from fossil fuels into renewable energies, and of course the development of new technologies are essential. So what we're seeing and what we believe it's really important to develop is technologies where we can replace fossil fuels, both for electricity generation, for transport and for the industry. So in these three areas, we see synthetic fuels are something in the mid to long term essential. And of course, for that you will need hydrogen generation. This is electrolyzer technology, where if we feed water and electricity, we can transform those two products into hydrogen, which is a gas. And then with other mechanisms, we can transform hydrogen in other kind of synthetic fuels that can be used in these three different areas that I was mentioning about.
Examples of collaboration that you had with SMEs and also with public authorities for green public procurement in the area of renewable energy sources,
Sure.
Technologies or services or both.
Yeah. What we have worked recently was for the installation of renewable gases in a factory. So basically, what we are seeing is that there's a high demand for the companies to replace their use of methane or natural gas. We have, together with the government, with a call for that companies can apply to, so a kind of a green procurement. We have helped the company to develop a program where they would install renewable electricity, so photovoltaics and windmills, electrolyzer for hydrogen generation, storage for the hydrogen and for water, so that they can have a supply of water throughout the entire year using rainfall. And then with that hydrogen methanization process that can just replace natural gas by methane, so the factory would not need to change any of their machines and they would do this. So this was a program initiated by the government where the companies would have some support to do all these installations.
And how did it go? Is it still in progress, or is it's already concluded?
No, it's in progress. It's still in the analysis phase. We saw a big number of drawbacks or problems that were hard to overtake. So legislation was a problem, so the company would have to change their financial code, so they actually need to be a gas producer, so they would need to update their financial situation. Safety concerns, there were a lot of safety concerns. You know, methane production, local methane production is not something that is widespread or done at all. So there are some gaps in the legislation there. Hiring of personnel that would do this is still problematic. So the project has not come forward yet. Legislation was absolutely a problem, and we're talking with the government and the energy directorate to try to see what we can do regarding this. These are situations that happen when you're working with new technologies. You don't know, you cannot foresee everything before actually start working with them. That's why green procurement is so relevant, that you can start opening the doors in all the sectors of the societies, not only for the companies, it's also for the public societies, and then for the companies that do the installations, the maintenance, and all the logistics around it.
What would say is the proportion of SMEs involved in green public procurement?
It's small. So what we are seeing is that most of SMEs, they understand that in the medium to long term, they will be carbon neutral, both by legal imposition, but also by their off-takers. So they will not be able to sell to companies if they are not carbon neutral. So,
sorry, but I was also asking from the point of view of the providers of these technologies. So SMEs who are actually producing these green technologies or services of both. Have you collaborated with any of them trying to sell the technologies to local government, to public procurement?
We have been involved in some upscaling of technologies, but it's an area where once the technology is developed, we believe that it's the place of the RTOs, the research and technology organizations, to get out, because it starts to be a business operation and not a technology operation. But I think it's you facing those companies. They are facing two big challenges. One is capital investment. So I think it's reasonably hard to get investment for something that is not proven track record yet. In particular, in the energy area, for several reasons.
Technology that is still in the stage of development and has not been totally accepted by the market, or is totally new to the market rather.
Yeah, I think that is the area that we definitely need to improve, because it's situations that are very risky. The energy sector in particular, I think it's quite traditional. It still has a strong financial component, so it's a business, of course, but we are also entering with the environmental part, and somewhere there has to be a compromise between the environment and the financial. It cannot only be a financial option. So these pre-procurements, we need to accelerate them in order to kickstart or accelerate even more the startups and technology developers that they will be able to put the technology in the market, but this probably takes decades in the energy sector. So photovoltaics, it's a technology that's been developed in the 50s, only now we're getting to see mass installation. So we need this mid-term step to actually accelerate. That would be excellent.
Thank you for clarifying. So you were mentioning before there are two main barriers, this what I got for SMEs to participate in public procurement. So one was the advancement of the technology. Were you thinking about something else as well?
Yeah, just to clarify, in the advancement of technology, we know exactly what we want, but we don't have the tools to do it, or the tools to do it are still not known. So the technology is developed, but not fully maturated, so that's a problem. And then there are other problems for the SMEs. I think that lack of personnel is a problem, so we need to invest a lot in upscaling. We need to have people trained in the new technologies, in the new mentalities. We need to have people that are capable to make and understand life cycle assessments. It's not trivial to do a very good life cycle assessment and then to understand the implications, because you have so many key parameters, indicators that you really need to know how we're doing that. We need to have easy and accessible legislation. So you can have a very specific legislation, but a set of documents that go in parallel to make the language more available. So it's not only a question, it's the entire society that has to go through. And the way to do this, of course, are the public green procurements, because it kickstarts on one side and starts forcing the other side. One last thing is that the supply and demand, they actually have to match. If you create a lot of demand without the supply, you actually get a lot of constraints. So if you have SMEs that are being leisurely forced to install technologies, but they cannot buy them or install them, you'll get a lot of problems. So it has to be a very balance between kickstarting it through green public procurement, but you have to make sure that all the areas are growing at the same time.
Yes, thank you first for making this clear, because this is definitely an area that we can clarify and that we can stress with the European Commission that this is something that needs support, obviously. So, are there any success stories that you would like to share with us where you collaborated in the past with local authorities, SMEs, in implementing this type of technologies to public procurement? Something that was really a good experience that gave very good results, and if so, what were the highlights of that experience?
Yeah. So something that we are seeing that it was an immense amount of work to start were the energy communities. So an energy community is something where, let's say, 3 or 4 buildings, they get together. One has some very high electrical consumption during the night, might be habitation. The other one might be a commerce, which uses a lot of electricity during the day. Another one might be, for instance, a storehouse that has a lot of PV panels but doesn't manage to consume everything. So they come together, they have a very nice load of consumption and some production, and this creates legally a new entity. So that entity is now only one that buys and sells electricity, and they can share among them. So you need a little bit of technology to do that, but you also need legislation. So this is the area that we're seeing that we've started some companies and some institutions to do that. This was not through procurement, but rather by desire. So the CTLs, they've started to say, we want to do this, and this is important to do, and we promote these things to happen. So legally, we cannot call it that it's a green procurement, but it's a quasi-green procurement, if I can invent that word right now. So, and we're seeing that you really needed to help the creation of a few of them so that people could see, okay, this is really nice, it works well, the legislation is starting to catch up, the people who install these things, they already know who are the suppliers, how to install, and so that's something that I think it's a good example.
Thank you. It's good to hear stories like this. So, are there any plans for you to collaborate with any local authority or SME to implement these technologies and these services in green sources of energy in the near future? Something, a plan or a desire, rather?
Yeah, so something that we are quite interested is in the area of renewable gases, both because we have been developing technology, and on the way to developing, we have been studying the applications that are currently present. So we had a good track record of understand how the return of investment is, what kind of technology assessment. So we have a connection with 2 or 3 SMEs that would like to make these connections. They are waiting for the opportunity to do the investments, and then we can support them, hopefully via a public green procurement.
Thank you so much for answering all my questions, Pedro. Is there anything else you would like to add at this point?
Well, I'm focusing a lot of electricity because that's really a key driver of, it supports everything that humanity grants, all granted. But basically, something that I would support and would like very much to see is that, so when I go and buy a refrigerator, I can see an energy tag. I can choose a refrigerator that doesn't use too much electricity. I would love to see a tag like that for environmental impact on most things that I would buy. I would like to go to the supermarket and choose, okay, these tomatoes, these things have less environmental impact than that thing or not. So I know that in some industries that is done in the background. For instance, textiles, they are mandated to do that to make sure that they're not polluting, these kind of things. But the legislation, I think this is something that we need to pass that information to the consumer so that to make sure that we have the option to do a green decision, if that makes some sense.
What in your opinion are the type of renewable energy sources that could be carried out could be in a more mass type of way?
In the short to medium term, solar. And in the short, we will not need storage, just to replace some of the storage. We have seen examples in California, Hawaii, Germany, and Europe that have huge installations of PV. 10, 15 years ago, people worried about the duck curve, which was a lot of consumption during the day, and that this would impact the electricity grid. We're seeing that grids are actually more resilient the more renewable sources you install. So we don't need to worry with storage in the short term. Let's install solar. After we pass a certain threshold, we need to install storage as well. So this is a short to medium term solution, and then we would start to have basically not more renewable production, but more efficient ways of storage for the short term, medium term, and long term. For instance, a country that depends a lot on hydro, but it's also resilient, that it's also dependent on years that rain a lot, it will need seasonal storage. And that's still something pretty much on its infancy at the moment.